Welcome, my friends, and let me regale you with a story of love lost and found, of long-buried secrets, and a truth that freed a young man from the shackles of his past. Enjoy the story. The sun cast long shadows across the weathered tombstones of St. Mary's Cemetery as Johnny knelt beside the grave, his calloused hands gently pulling weeds from the dry earth. The 20-year-old had called these hallowed grounds his sanctuary ever since he could remember, finding solace among the dead as he struggled to survive on the unforgiving streets of the city. As he worked, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Glancing up, Johnny saw an elegantly dressed woman in her mid-40s making her way through the rows of graves, her designer heels sinking into the soft grass with each step. He watched as she approached, curious what had brought such a refined lady to this forgotten corner of the cemetery. When the woman reached the grave, she let out a strangled sob, her shoulders shaking as she sank to her knees. Alarmed, Johnny rose to his feet. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. "Do you need me to call someone?" The woman shook her head, wiping at her tears with a lace-trimmed handkerchief. No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disturb you. It's just this grave. I've been here before to pray for her soul." Johnny frowned, perplexed. As far as he knew, this was his mother's resting place, the only connection he had to the woman who gave him life before abandoning him to the streets. How could the stranger possibly know her? "I think you may be mistaken, ma'am," he said gently. "This is my mother's grave. Antonia Morales." The woman's head snapped up, her red-rimmed eyes widening in shock. "No, that can't be right. Here. Oh, Lord, the woman who stole my baby is buried here." Johnny stared at her, his mind reeling. "Stole your baby? What are you talking about?" Taking a shaky breath, the woman stood, smoothing her skirt. "I'm sorry, I haven't even introduced myself. My name is Nancy Carlson, and if Antonia is buried here, then you must be my son." Johnny gaped at Nancy, certain he must have misheard. "Your son?" "Lady, I think you've got the wrong guy. My mother was no kidnapper." Nancy shook her head sadly. "I wish that were true, but the story I have to tell will change everything you thought you knew." She gestured to a nearby bench. "Please, will you let me explain?" Warily, Johnny followed her to the bench and sat, keeping a careful distance between them. Nancy clasped her hands in her lap, her gaze distant as she began her tale. 20 years ago, I was a young maid working for the wealthy Davenport family. I fell in love with their younger son, William. When I became pregnant, I foolishly thought he would marry me." She let out a bitter laugh. "Of course, his family would never allow their golden boy to wed a lowly servant. They paid me off and sent me away in disgrace." Johnny listened, transfixed, as Nancy described how alone and desperate she had been. "That's when I met Antonia. She offered to help me, to be my friend when I had no one else. But it was all a ruse. The Davenports hired her to pose as my confidant, to spirit my baby away and leave me with nothing." She looked at Johnny, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "You were that baby, my precious boy, ripped from my arms before I even had a chance to hold you. I've spent the last 20 years searching, never giving up hope that I would find you." As she finished her story, Nancy swayed on the bench, her face pale. Johnny reached out to steady her just as her eyes rolled back, and she slumped forward in a dead faint. "Help!" Johnny shouted, easing Nancy to the ground. "Somebody help, please!" Footsteps pounded on the gravel path, and then Sanchez, the cemetery caretaker, was kneeling beside them, his weathered face etched with concern. Together they managed to revive Nancy, fanning her face until she blinked open her eyes, dazed and disoriented. "Take it easy, ma'am," Sanchez said, helping her to sit up. "You gave us quite a scare." Nancy clutched at Johnny's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to frighten you. It's just the shock of finally finding you after all these years." Johnny swallowed hard, his mind spinning with the weight of her revelation. Could it be true? Was this woman really his mother, and the woman he'd called Mom his whole life nothing more than a kidnapper? He needed answers, and he needed them now. Johnny helped Nancy back to the bench, his heart pounding as he tried to process everything she had told him. Sanchez hovered nearby, concern etched on his weathered face. "You okay, kid?" he asked gruffly. You need me to call the cops or something? Johnny shook his head. No, I think we need some privacy. To talk. Sanchez hesitated, then nodded. I'll be in my office if you need me. Just holler. As the caretaker walked away, Johnny turned to Nancy, his eyes searching her face for any hint of deception. I want to believe you, he said slowly, but it's a lot to take in. I need more than just your word. Nancy reached into her purse and pulled out a tattered photograph. This is us, she said softly, handing it to Johnny. You were just a few hours old. With trembling fingers, Johnny took the photo. It showed a much younger Nancy, her face glowing with exhausted joy as she cradled a tiny bundle in her arms. A baby with wisps of dark hair and achingly familiar eyes. His eyes. Johnny touched the photo reverently, feeling a lump rise in his throat. It's really me, he whispered. But why? Why would Antonia do this? Nancy sighed. Money. The Davenports paid her handsomely to take you and disappear. They couldn't risk a scandal, not with William poised to inherit the family fortune. Anger surged through Johnny, hot and fierce. All his life, he'd struggled and scraped by on the streets while his so-called mother lived in comfort, never wanting for anything. And for what? To protect the reputation of some rich snobs who couldn't be bothered to take responsibility for their own actions. So what happens now? He asked, his voice rough. You just show up out of the blue and expect me to play happy families? Nancy flinched as if he'd struck her. No, of course not. I know we can't make up for lost time overnight, but Johnny, I've spent 20 years dreaming of this moment, of holding you in my arms again. She reached out tentatively, her hand hovering just shy of his cheek. Please, give me a chance. Give us a chance. Johnny closed his eyes, torn. A part of him wanted to run, to protect himself from further hurt and disappointment. But another part, the lonely little boy who'd always yearned for a mother's love, couldn't resist the promise of connection, of belonging. Slowly, hesitantly, he leaned into Nancy's touch, feeling the warmth of her palm against his skin. Okay, he whispered. I'll try. As Johnny and Nancy sat in tearful reunion, her cell phone buzzed with an incoming call. Wiping her eyes, Nancy glanced at the screen and blanched. It's the hospice, she said urgently. We need to go now. Hospice? Johnny asked, confused. What's going on? Nancy stood, tugging Johnny to his feet. It's your father, William. He's dying of cancer, and he doesn't have much time left. Johnny reeled, feeling like he'd been punched in the gut. My father? But I know this is a shock, Nancy said gently. But William is the one who told me the truth about what happened all those years ago. His mother, your grandmother, orchestrated the whole sordid affair. She's gone now, but William, he wants to make amends, to see you before it's too late. Johnny let Nancy lead him to her car, his mind whirling with the revelations of the past few hours. A mother, a father, a family he'd never known existed. It was almost too much to bear. They drove in tense silence to the hospice, Nancy's knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. When they arrived, she led Johnny through the hushed halls to a private room, where a frail, wasted man lay propped up on pillows, his once handsome face ravaged by illness. William, Nancy said softly, moving to the bedside. I found him. I found our son. The man's sunken eyes flickered open, hope and disbelief warring in their depths. Johnny, he rasped, his voice thin and reedy. Is it really you? Johnny approached slowly, studying the stranger who was his father. He saw echoes of his own features in the man's face, the same dark hair and olive skin. Yeah, he said hoarsely. It's me. Tears spilled down William's cheeks as he reached out a trembling hand. My boy, my beautiful boy, I'm so sorry, for everything. Johnny took his father's hand, feeling the paper-thin skin and brittle bones. I don't understand, he said, his voice breaking. Why did you let them take me? Why didn't you fight for me? William closed his eyes, shame etched in every line of his face. I was weak, he whispered. A coward. I let my mother bully me into silence, convinced me that a scandal would ruin us. But I never stopped thinking about you, never stopped wondering. He broke off, coughing harshly. Nancy held a cup of water to his lips, helping him drink. When the spasm passed, William looked at Johnny with pleading eyes. Forgive me, he begged. please, forgive me. I know I don't deserve it, but I couldn't bear to die without telling you how much I love you, how much I've always loved you." Johnny bowed his head, tears blurring his vision. For so long, he'd yearned for a father's love, a father's approval, and now, to have it offered so freely, so unconditionally, it was almost more than he could bear. "I forgive you," he choked out. "I forgive you, Dad." A beatific smile spread across William's face, peace settling over his ravaged features. "Thank you," he breathed. "Thank you, son." With a final sigh, William closed his eyes and slipped away, his hand going slack in Johnny's grasp. Nancy let out a soft cry, gathering Johnny into her arms as they wept together, united in their grief and their love. The funeral was a somber affair, Johnny and Nancy standing hand in hand as they said their final goodbyes to William. In his will, he had left everything to his son: the fortune, the family estate, the chance at a better life. But for Johnny, the greatest gift was the one he'd already received: the love of the mother he'd always longed for, and the memory of a father who, in the end, had chosen to do the right thing. As they walked out of the funeral home into the bright sunlight, Johnny felt a sense of hope and possibility that he'd never known before. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were years of hurt and separation to overcome, wounds that would take time to heal. But with Nancy by his side, Johnny knew he could face whatever challenges lay ahead. They had each other now, a true family bound not by blood, but by the unbreakable ties of love and forgiveness. And as they stepped forward into their new life together, Johnny felt a smile curve his lips. The future was bright, and for the first time in his life, he couldn't wait to see what tomorrow would bring.